Thank you for joining us today for this important conversation about the neuromuscular community and back to school in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Justin Moy, alumni MDA National Ambassador and current student at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts, and I look forward to our conversation today. I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Christopher Rosa, who is the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Student Inclusion Initiatives at the City University of New York, and he's also a former MDA board member. Thanks for joining us, Chris. We're so glad to have you today.
Wonderful to see you, Justin. It's an honor for me to be here with you this afternoon and my MDA family. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, Chris and I are thrilled to be here. Please know we are offering our perspective on the current issues neuromuscular families are facing in regards to attending school. We are not offering advice on what you should do. Only you and your family can decide what's right for you. We look forward to spending the next 40 minutes sharing with you our thoughts on this important topic while also answering your questions. Please know that both Chris and I are most familiar with the post-secondary education system as a college student and college administrator, but we will be offering our perspective on other school settings as well. So, Chris, to start the conversation, can you tell me a little about your current institution and how they are handling the COVID-19 pandemic and fall classes looking to begin?
Thank you, Justin. As you know, I work at the City University of New York, otherwise known as CUNY, and we're the largest public urban university system in the nation, enrolling more than 270,000 students at 25 campuses in the 5 boroughs in New York City. And in March, in New York City, we found ourselves at the time as the epicenter of the global COVID-19 pandemic. And like many higher ed institutions across the country and around the globe, we had to very quickly mobilize to pivot to move from face-to-face instruction for those more than 200,000 students taking 50,000 courses, all face-to-face on our campuses, and then rapidly pivot to online learning. It was a bit of a bumpy ride. But thanks to the resilience of our students and our faculty and their creativity, I felt like we all got through it together without anybody getting left behind. And I think the ultimate testament to our work together is that we were proud in June to confer more than 50,000 degrees to students who were able to complete their education in the midst of this global pandemic. So now we're at the end of July, and in New York City, we find ourselves in a different place. Thankfully, through all of our hard work and sacrifice, adhering to social distancing protocols, following public health protocols, we've been able to flatten the curve and contain the spread of the coronavirus in New York State. But in consultation with our state leadership, out of an abundance of caution, we made the tough decision to continue online instruction for the fall semester in the interest of making sure that the wellness of our students is paramount. And while I know that's tough for a lot of us to digest because of how deeply we value our campus communities, it's our homes, it's where we meet the people that we love and the learning enterprise. We feel at this moment it's the right thing, and we're encouraged by the lessons that we learned and the positive experience we had in distance learning in the spring, and we have great optimism that it'll only improve the learning experience for students this fall.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. There are so many things that you have to take into consideration when making those decisions to go back. I know, at least for me, I'm a pretty cautious person, and especially with this whole situation, there can never be zero risk. And for me to make my decision to go back, I tried to look at what is an acceptable amount of risk that I'm willing to take. And I think with WPI's president, Lori Leshin, being on the Massachusetts State Reopening Board and seeing her guidance and seeing that it is safe if we follow all of these guidelines to go back, then I think it was, for me, worth the risk to make that decision to go back. So let's go to our next question. So, with all of this virtual learning, how have you seen virtual learning evolve over the past few years, and specifically since the pandemic began?
So, Justin, online and distance learning has been a regular feature of higher education globally, but particularly in the United States for the last 15 years. And over that time, we've seen a veritable explosion of online learning at college campuses. Right before the advent of the pandemic, there were 6.6 million college students in the United States enrolled in some form of online learning. And 3.1 million of those students were enrolled full time, taking all of their college courses in online higher education programs. So there was already a significant imprint of online learning in the United States prior to the pandemic. With the pandemic in March, higher ed institutions across the United States dramatically pivoted to online learning. And so this past spring, there were almost 20 million online learners in college in the United States. And that was heartening to see that we could collectively create the capacity in order to allow students to sustain their higher education through online learning. I think that once we're all beyond this pandemic, what many experts are predicting is that online learning is here to stay in some form or another, and that this pandemic nudged us into a different paradigm for college and online learning. And so, as higher ed communities, we are all going to reimagine what the future of college and university instruction means and the college experience means in an online and distance learning environment. And that's going to require students to learn differently and to behave differently than they have in the past. It's going to require faculty to teach differently. And it's going to challenge higher ed institutions to create very rich and meaningful student life experiences using digital platforms that complement the in person college experience that we've all grown to know and love.
Hmm. There are so many things that we need to do differently now, and that's especially true for people with specialized education plans. So, do you have any thoughts or examples on how virtual learning can be adapted to fit kids who have specialized education plans?
Sure, Justin. And as you referenced in the opening conversation, you and I know more about post secondary education, but specialized learning plans refer to kids with disabilities in K through 12, whose rights and opportunities are protected under the IDEA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And as we've pivoted to online learning, I don't want to sugarcoat it. I know that it's been really hard on kids with disabilities and their families and their caretakers. They've been challenged to sustain kids' educational opportunities in comparative isolation. And parents and caregivers, in particular, have been thrust in a situation where they have to serve as kids' academic coaches, as their occupational therapist, as their physical therapist, as their assistive technology specialist, as their paraprofessionals, all the resources that they would have gotten by virtue of being physically present at their schools. So it's been very hard on the kids themselves, on the people who support their opportunities, um, and um, and it's been hard on teachers too, who really miss their kids. That being said, the key, I think, to meaningful online learning for kids with disabilities is to begin with the specialized education plans, the IEPs and the 504 plans. The foundation of those plans are goals that were developed in cooperation and in consultation involving students with disabilities themselves, their families, and educators, special educators in particular. And I would encourage families to build from the goals, to look at what the goals were, and to understand that those goals were situated in a particular context. And now the context has changed. but the goals have not. And IEPs and 504 plans were made to be living, breathing, and evolving documents. And parents have every right on behalf of their kids to leverage those plans to make sure that they get access and opportunity to the services that they need. I encourage parents, when possible, to lean on each other, to share best practices, to share what works with kids, and to lean on each other for support for systems advocacy that they need in order to get the rights and opportunities to which they're entitled.
Uh, and on that, you mentioned that parents and caregivers are spending a lot more time with the education of their children. So, do you have any advice or resources for parents who will possibly be spending more time directing their child's education with distance learning?
One thing that I think will be a consistent theme of any and all conversation that we have around our experiences in education in COVID-19 is for everybody who's charged with serving as a caretaker to make sure that they have the opportunity to exercise self-care. So as families and collective units that support the learning of kids at home, I think it would serve everyone well if they could work together to build in time for respite care for the parents and the caretakers who are on the front lines of supporting the education of their kids. In terms of very practical resources, we're all lucky to be part of the MDA community, which lifts up these issues and regards them as paramount to our wellness, access, and opportunity. And I'm always pleased to direct families served by MDA to the MDA Resource Hub, which has really good information about rights and opportunities and best practices for kids with disabilities in K through 12, and the MDA National Resource Center, which is an interactive resource where people can contact the center and get advice on best practices and resources to support their kids.
Hmm. And again, there's so much happening right now, so many different solutions to education in the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know that schools are moving forward with reopening in person, but also schools are opening with hybrid models as well. And there are also those that are going fully virtual. So, with a myriad of circumstances, what are you hearing from students in the neuromuscular community around their thoughts on returning to classes?
Well, first of all, just to provide a little bit of context, excuse me, this is a rapidly evolving and ever shifting circumstance. But if you look at the national picture, roughly 50% of colleges and universities have made the decision to go online in their instruction in the fall, and another 50% have made the decision to return to in-person learning or hybrid learning with very stringent public health and distance and social distancing protocols. So it's important to know the plan that your higher ed institution has in place. And so when I've had the opportunity to speak with people with neuromuscular disabilities who are going to college or returning to college, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of ambivalence and a lot of anxiety. Obviously, many of us with neuromuscular disabilities have underlying health conditions that make us particularly vulnerable during this global pandemic to the most harmful effects of COVID-19. So I think there's a heightened concern and sensitivity and awareness to that. But by the same token, I think we miss our campus communities. Our college campuses are our homes. It's where our friends are. It's where our dreams are located in many respects. That coupled with the fact that while we've gotten through online learning in the spring, it really hasn't been easy. Very often, if you're learning from home, you're learning from home in the same household with one or more family members who are continuing to work through distance work. And you're sharing computers and technology and other resources with people who are working using those same resources, and maybe other kids in K through 12 who are relying on that same space and those same resources in order to work. So the learning conditions aren't optimal, and there's a longing to get back to environments which are crafted with learning in mind. So there's a lot of ambivalence and a lot of conflicting emotions about it. And the good news is that as people with neuromuscular disabilities, each and every day we have a great deal of experience of assessing and managing risk. Each and every day in our lives, because of our desire to be independent, and living with the realities of neuromuscular disease, we're very used to assessing the risks and weighing it against the prospective rewards. And the key is just getting the most information you can about your campus reopening plans. What are their plans for sanitizing and cleansing spaces? What are their plans around social distancing? What are their plans around wearing face coverings? What are their plans around testing and contact tracing, so that we're ensuring to the greatest extent possible that we're in a learning bubble that's free of the risk of COVID-19. This and other considerations are really critical when making informed choices about what is best for you in the fall. And I know that you have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think at least during the beginning of the summer, everybody was still sort of scrambling to figure out what to do. And I think in some sense that's still the case. There's still unknowns. But I think an important part for me was the communication from the university and knowing that their intent was sincere and that they were working their hardest to ensure that guidelines were followed and safety protocols were put into place. Um, I now know, though, that at least with WPI, we're going to be doing twice weekly testing, which is really important for containing any outbreaks and preventing just infection in general. Additionally, one of the safety protocols in place is we're not allowed to interact with people outside of our residence halls. And while this came a little bit later in July, I knew that it was coming because I had contact from the university proactively on their end to assure us that, hey, we're working on something, we have a plan in place, we're in communication, we have this fact page, we're ready to deal with this. And I think before concrete policies were put into place, that's what you had to rely on. But again, to your point, it's so important to be up to date on those policies, reading those policies. And that shows an onus that the higher education, the college has. So to the next question, my child is in college and requires a personal care attendant to live in the dorms. During COVID, with the guidelines in place, do colleges need to accommodate for this type of arrangement?
So, Justin, they absolutely do. As you know, the need for personal assistance services or a personal care attendant, while it is a service of a personal nature, and colleges and universities themselves are not required to provide those services or fund those services, for people who need them as a reason, as an accommodation in order to live independently and to traverse and interact on a campus independently with their support, it is absolutely required that colleges and universities allow individuals who need PCAs access to them, even in a time of COVID-19. Now, as a practical matter, how we prepare ourselves to make sure that we can have meaningful access to the PCAs that we need requires a lot of work on our part. I think that's just the reality. Among other things, it requires alerting the campus that there's going to be someone who is not a student or a member of the professional staff being on the campus on a regular basis. And it's likely that those individuals will have to be screened as they enter the campus, in either through testing or at the very least temperature checks as they come onto campus, and they will be required to adhere to the same public health protocols that all other members of the campus community adhere to. We're going to have to make sure that the necessary PPE for those PCAs and for ourselves is available either through the campus or by whatever means necessary, just to make sure that we are kept safe and that the people who provide our care are safe. And their contact information is going to need to be known to our campuses, because all college campuses are going to have to participate in contact tracing in the event that there is a positive test and a PCA comes into contact potentially or is exposed to somebody who had a positive test. And finally, and most importantly, from a practical perspective, we're all going to need a backup plan, because if our PCA tests positive or needs to quarantine because of exposure to someone with a positive result, we're going to need to make sure that we have a backup plan to get the personal care that we need in order to continue to live independently on the campus. So it's readily achievable, but it does take a lot of advanced planning.
Definitely, and that advanced planning and risk management is so important. I know, at least with me in my scenario, I was lucky enough that my brother was admitted to WPI as a freshman this year. And when weighing the benefits of having outside PCAs, that was a really tough decision. And unfortunately, I had to let them go, because if I was bringing in people from the outside, uh, that would bring risk of infection to the student community. And WPI is trying so hard to create that bubble to protect their community. So once I knew that it would have to be my brother being my PCA, I immediately reached out to my campus accessibility office just to let them know, hey, this is the plan. How can you help me with this? And we were able to get it so that he was able to room with me, which was really important for my risk of infection. Or, again, I don't want to infect any of my other PCAs. So, again, working with your accessibility office, working with residential services, getting that plan down as soon as possible was so important. So let's go on to our next question then. So we've talked about sort of life in general, being able to do the various functions with PCAs. But the other important aspect, and probably most important aspect of college, is education. Obviously, you're going there to learn something. So do you have any tips on how students can stay connected with their teachers when doing distance learning?
Well, Justin, you tapped on to something very, very important. Staying connected with your faculty is critical on a lot of levels. First of all, the research shows that students' ability to succeed, to persist towards their degrees is highly correlated with their connections that they make with their faculty. So checking in with faculty, building a relationship, just as a general principle, is highly associated with student success. So for that reason alone, it's important to connect with faculty. But it's also important because when you're learning in the distance learning environment, very often the grading rubric involves some portion of class participation or class engagement. So your ability to establish a relationship with faculty, for them to know who you are, to have an identity in this virtual relationship, is really important for you to be able to succeed, and for the faculty to understand that you're engaged. And finally, building that relationship is very important to ameliorating the barriers to learning that you may encounter as a student with a disability. From my experience working with students and faculty this past spring, there was a pervasive sense that we're all in this together, and that it might be a bumpy ride, but one way or the other, we're all going to put our heads together and devise solutions that allow students to continue learning, for their work to be assessed, sometimes in non-traditional ways, but all with an interest of allowing students to complete the semester. And having that kind of relationship helps to build the goodwill that is so helpful in getting faculty on board to devise effective strategies to create access to learning. And the Campus Disability Services Office, the Access Center that you referred to on your own campus, can be a real critical player in helping students to build effective relationships with faculty. So I recommend availing ourselves of that resource.
Mhm. Definitely. And I think that when going through all of this, it can kind of get complicated. Oh, do I reach out? What do I do? How am I going to make sure that I do everything that I need to? And I know at least for me, acronyms can be helpful. And so I have an acronym called ACT, which is Ask Your Campus Accessibility Service Office for help. And I think, again, we've hit on this point a lot, but the Accessibility Service Office or Disability Service Office, it can have a lot of different names, but they're there for you. If they can't help you, then they'll refer you to who can help you. And in my experience, they've been able to ping me over to residential services or dining services or all these different departments that you may not necessarily know about yourself. And they've been really helpful for me. For incoming students, too, I know at least at WPI, they were doing online Zoom intakes, which is really helpful to build that connection. The second part of ACT was communicate, and that's communicating with your professors. So first you want to work with your accessibility office to get those accommodations on paper, get a plan on paper. But really, it's so different for lots of different classes and professors on how they're actually going to teach. So communicating with them how you want to apply the plan that you create with disability services in a way that works for both you and the professor, online classes versus in-person classes, exam protocols. I know extra time, half time. How does that work in the pandemic? And that's really on a per professor basis on how they're going to work that out. So again, communication, very important. Um, and thirdly, the T is for talk, and that's talking with your academic advisor. I don't know if you have academic advising at CUNY, do you?
We do
Yeah.
a very robust system of
hmm
academic advice. Good point.
hmm Um, and I'm sure at CUNY and at WPI as well, academic advising is really helpful because they know how class loads are. They've guided students on how to build optimal classes. What sort of professors are you going to be dealing with? How can I fit my schedule to best suit my needs? And also be accommodating towards professors who are also pretty busy. And then lastly, I like to add F at the end. That doesn't really fit anywhere, but I think following up is so important. We have busy lives. I'm sure you have a busy life as a college administrator. So being able to follow up really just ensures that you're on top of things, they're on top of things, and things get done. Um, so with that in mind, Chris, we've talked about communicating with academics. We've talked about communicating with just student life, living in general. But we haven't really talked about school support systems specifically. So, do you have any tips on staying connected and involved with your school support systems?
I do. Thanks, Justin. It's critically important to student wellness and success. Um, I think that, first of all, availing ourselves of digital platforms like the ones that we're on now to connect with faculty are critically important. I think we'll find that our faculty are open and eager to hear from students. And I think that the key is being proactive about reaching out, about setting them up, and realizing that now more than ever before, it's important to schedule regular opportunities to interact with faculty and key student resources. Most colleges and universities are taking virtual appointments, pre scheduled appointments at academic advisement centers, at counseling centers, with Disability Services Office and faculty during virtual office hours. So it's important to avail yourselves of those digital scheduling systems in order to book your appointment, keep those appointments. It's a little old school, but I know faculty very often just appreciate a phone call. It's just nice to hear a voice in a 20th century way, but it's still a great way to connect, and even via email. But being consistent and checking in regularly, I think, is really important to stay connected and to keep up your academic momentum on your courses.
Hmm. Definitely. I know that some people can feel overwhelmed with those emails, though. So being able to, I guess, keep on top of those. I know for me personally, email filters and that search bar, if you know how to use them, can be incredibly helpful for managing that. And on top of that, too, you talked a lot about academic advising, getting in contact with your professors. Uh, One of my classes was actually canceled for the fall semester due to COVID. So I had to reach out to my academic advisor, and we were able to come up with a plan. And she knew the department, she knew what was going on. She knew that one of the professors might be leaving next year on sabbatical, so it would probably be a better idea to take this bioinformatics class over a biochemistry class. And being able to have the comfort to reach out and then to be able to follow up on that plan, I think was really helpful for me to be able to know what I needed to do. Uh, and with that too, having to do all this stuff, especially in a crisis, can really take a toll on your mental health. So I want to know from you, how are you personally dealing with all the lifestyle changes COVID-19 is causing?
Thank you for asking. I've been fortunate. I'm managing well. As a higher ed professional who works in student affairs, for me, mental health and being proactive about mental health for students and the people who serve them is a core value. And I try to model that core value as best I can in my personal life. And so I've been in a therapeutic counseling relationship for 15 years now, and it's been really, really important to me. The first 14 years have been face-to-face counseling sessions every 2 weeks, either at my mental health professional's office or at a Starbucks. And so that has been, this has been a very different experience for me. Um, Instead, I have been working in an online setting, uh, keeping my counseling appointments through Zoom meetings, and it's been very important to me, highly effective, and it's something that I encourage for all members of a campus community. And I think that there are a lot of key mental health resources that can really help. First of all, there are counseling resources available at the campus counseling center, still available by appointments on most campuses. And there are a lot of digital resources that can help us at home. For example, like mindfulness and meditation apps that can really, really help.
Hmm. Uh, and so it seems like you've hit upon a few key points, which is one, professional counseling, uh, two, having that routine, and three, really focusing on yourself and just that introspection. So, as a follow up, do you have any advice for students and their caregivers for maintaining good mental health during this time specifically?
What I think is very critical is, first of all, self care is very, very important. But it's also important to be mindful of the health and wellness needs of the people who are caring for us. And very often that just means being very, very intentional about setting aside the time and the resources in order to let the family members, the PCAs, those people who are so critical to our wellness and independence, to be able to take the care that they need in order to refresh and recharge and be well.
Hmm. Definitely. And that self care is so important. But when you're working with so many people, you also have to be mindful of their schedules, what they're doing. I know for me, keeping a family calendar, I'm living with my family right now, was important because then we knew, oh, don't bother Justin right now, don't bother Nicholas right now. Mom has something to do. Uh, and being able to be mindful of everybody around us was so important to keeping us all sane. For me personally, too, getting in contact with my student clubs and activities that I did while on campus was also really helpful. Just keeping in contact with the people that I would normally interact with. Something that we did, at least as an officer, we tried to have virtual meetings. And so in a few of them, we brought in people to do virtual craft. So this was for the Society for Medieval Arts and Sciences. And we all had our pens and our papers down there drawing these Celtic knots. And we had an instructor over Zoom being, here's what you could improve, here's how you start out. And I think having that connection, even if it was virtual, was so nice and so helpful. But at the same time, we can't talk about all of these things that we're doing without acknowledging the Americans with Disabilities Act and how that paved the way for us to be really discussing college, secondary education, primary education, post secondary education for people with disabilities. So, to wrap up, Chris, with the 30th anniversary just happening this past weekend of the Americans with Disabilities Act, I want your perspective on this landmark legislation and what it means to you.
Well, thank you for asking, Justin. It's a very powerful milestone moment for the American disability community. The ADA is one of the most far-reaching pieces of civil rights legislation ever enacted. And we know it as an important legal document which protects our rights and opportunities to equal access and opportunity in all aspects of American life. We certainly come to know it as a significant political achievement and political document being forged by the bipartisan support of both houses of Congress, which seems something remarkable in this day and age, something impossible seemingly in 2020. But most importantly, it's a powerful cultural document which embodies the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of the American disability community and articulates to American society and culture the way that we want to be regarded and our vision for ourselves and our understanding of ourselves in contemporary American life. It's significant that the name of the act itself, it's not the Handicapped Americans Act, it's not the Americans with Special Needs Act, it's not the Differently Abled Americans Act, it's the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it underscores the fact that all of us as individuals with disabilities in the United States see ourselves as first and foremost Americans with the same hopes, dreams, and aspirations and fears as all other Americans. And yet we are people who are increasingly fiercely proud of our identities as people with disabilities. And we're actively involved through communities like MDA and our larger disability rights movement in remaking American society in our own image. We're a force for equity and inclusion, and that's all in part because of the power and the promise of the ADA. And I just as a quick reminder for me, the ADA is alive and well, and it's never been more important than it has been during the pandemic. The ADA is literally saving the lives of people like us. As healthcare resources become scarce in communities that are overwhelmed by COVID-19, there's a fear that there will be a need to ration limited healthcare resources, ventilators, emergency room slots, ICU beds. And the ADA protects us from discrimination in determining the method in which healthcare providers will plan to meet the needs of the community without discriminating against us on the basis of a misunderstanding about what our quality of life could be like and what our trajectory is. We're going to change the world as leaders, and the ADA protects us from discrimination and sets us on a path in order to do just that.
Thank you so much, Chris, for sharing your perspective on the ADA. I know for myself, my college experience wouldn't have been possible without the work of your generation and the people before me. But despite all of this, there is still more work to do. While this pandemic brings challenges, it also gives us the chance on an individual and community level to shape inclusivity and accessibility for future generations and for leading another 30 years of the ADA. So that concludes our discussion today. I would like to thank everyone for attending today's Facebook Live event. If you were unable to join the full conversation, the recording will be posted for playback on Facebook, as well as at mda.org/COVID-19. Chris, I would again like to thank you for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts and experiences.
Thank you, Justin. It's been my honor to be here with you today and with my MDA family. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So stay up to date with future Facebook Live events by liking MDA's Facebook page at MDA.org, and MDA looks forward to continuing these important conversations with you. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today. On behalf of Chris and MDA, I wish you all well and good health.